And now let's welcome Carol Bellamy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Diane managed to thank everybody, but she forgot to thank herself. So I think we could... Well, I'm delighted to be here. As you probably heard, I'm a New Yorker, but who could turn down an opportunity to be in St. Pete in February? So thank you very much. I couldn't have thought of anything that would make me happier. So it seems a good moment, I hope, to take a new look at what might seem to be an old story, and that's so the theme of my presentation tonight, the rights and the plights of children. I faced a little bit of a dilemma when thinking about what to say to you this evening. Where should I start? Do I start with the rights or with the plights? Should I start with the bad news, the plights, and then finish with a flourish of good news, the rights? Or do I start with the 30 years of success stories about child rights, only to shatter your positive mood by listing the many, many plights that confront children today? So I decided on neither of those. I'm just going to mix it up a little bit. Because the reality is that rights and plights are not equal concepts with equal weight. They are not, and I hope you'll excuse the old cliche, two sides of the same coin. Look at any aspect of child well-being, whether it is education or violence against children or helping them to make their voices heard, and you will find rights and plights pushing and pulling against each other in a non-stop battle for supremacy. Now, I'm glad to say that child rights have a powerful ally called the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. With all the 90 speakers in it, you'll discover that in every field of endeavor, we have our own languages. So in the international field, we have our own letters that we all just say to each other, SDGs, and we assume people know what they are. So the Sustainable Development Goals, they were adopted globally by all countries of the world in 2015. These global goals cannot be achieved unless they are achieved for children. They're not focused only on children, but they include within them a focus on children, and they provide welcome reinforcements for the fight to uphold child rights. They've also added real momentum as countries race to achieve these goals by the deadline, which was set for 2030. But now I'm going to go back a little bit. Let's go back to 1989. It was truly an exceptional year. A new world order was taking shape as hammers and chisels broke through the Berlin Wall. Apartheid was in full retreat, and Tim Berners-Lee was putting the finishing touches to the World Wide Web. And in New York, world leaders came together in a rare moment of global unity. They came together and they adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They made a firm promise to all children to protect and fulfill their rights. This historic international law captured a profound, and at that time, frankly, a groundbreaking idea about childhood. That children are not just little adults in training or just the property of their parents. They are human beings and individuals with their own rights. And they have the right, under this legally binding convention, to a real childhood. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is now the most ratified human rights treaty in the history of the world. There's only one country that has not yet ratified it. I won't mention which country that is. 193 have, one hasn't. Rights, according to the convention, are a constant. They are immovable. They are universal. Because of the convention, every child, whether they live in the heart of the richest city in the world or on the edge of the poorest village, every child has the right to survive, to thrive, to participate, and to be protected. Basically, they have the right to a happy childhood. And these do not change, ever. They have no expiry date. And that is important for several reasons. I'll give two. Because plights actually do change. They change all the time. They evolve and shape shift. Sadly, human beings seem to have an endless and dismal capacity to come up with new ways to do harm to children, while continuing to pile up old form of rights violations. And second, because childhood itself is actually changing. The rise of digital technology, climate change, prolonged conflicts, and mass migration are transforming childhood throughout the world. For millions of children, the plights are severe, they are life-threatening, they are soul-destroying. And when we let them, they can pollute even the finest examples of human ingenuity and creativity, including the internet and social media. Thankfully, those who drafted the convention made it broad enough and tough enough to take on whatever new horrors that we adults can throw at it. It applies to the rights violations that are happening today, and it will apply to any new violations that emerge in the future, because it is built on solid foundations, 4 really good solid foundations. First, very important foundation, that of non-discrimination. Every child has the right and same universal rights, regardless of their ethnicity, their gender, their religion, their language, their abilities, regardless of anything. Every child has universal rights. Second foundation, the best interest of the child. Every decision taken on behalf of children or taken with them must be in their best interests, and with all other interests put to one side. Third, the right to life, survival, and development. As well as surviving, each child has the right to reach their full potential. Recognition that just making it through childhood in reasonable health is not enough. And fourth, and very importantly, the right to be heard. I see this as one of the convention's most powerful and transformative legacies. Its 54 articles cover every aspect of children's lives. And it must be seen as a whole. No cherry picking here. All the rights are linked, and no right of the child is more important than another. To put it simply, the convention has changed the way we view and the way we treat children. Before the convention, dare I say BC here, before the convention, children were often seen and treated as passive recipients of support or charity. Today, they are seen as rights holders. That's a very crucial distinction. They have rights that go above and beyond those enjoyed by adults precisely because they are children, because they are vulnerable, and because they need extra care and support. Back in 1989, I have no idea what was happening in 1889, although that's probably one of the panels that you'll be going to, so you'll find out. But back in 1989, cash-strapped governments, many of them facing massive debts or conflicts or droughts or floods, had a long to-do list. While everyone proclaimed that they cared deeply about children, who would ever say that they did not? I must say, having said that every nation in the world other than ours, when this one has endorsed the convention, it doesn't mean that all of them are protecting children. In any case, while everyone proclaimed that they cared about children and cared about the needs of children, those needs and rights were often way down the to-do list. Child rights were often seen as something that would be tackled, yes, sometime, hopefully soon, when time and resources allowed, when the adults got around to it. The convention in many ways changed all of that. Upholding the rights of children was now a legally binding obligation, rather than just an optional extra. Today, governments are expected to meet that obligation, and they are held to account. Even though not all of them do, they actually are held to account by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. to which governments must report. Some of them squirm a little. Wealthy countries, I will tell you in particular, squirm quite a lot when confronted with evidence that their track record on child rights is less than stellar. Others, including some quite challenged countries, lower income countries, and I would mention in this case Bangladesh and Ethiopia, are examples of actually what can be achieved, even with relatively limited resources. If there is a real commitment to children, countries can achieve. Both of those countries have made impressive progress on education in particular over the past 30 years. Bangladesh has had 2 female prime ministers over most of that time. They actually hate each other. But each of them has made a commitment to girls' education, and Bangladesh actually has closed the gap in terms of education in boys and girls, at least in primary school. And I use those 2 as examples. They are not the only success stories in town. So let me talk about some of the big ticket achievements for child rights over the past 2 or 3 decades. Well, governments have shifted their laws, policies, and their budgets to align with the Constitution in many cases to make sure that more children do get the health care and the nutrition that they need to survive and develop. Many governments have focused on children that leave school. Fewer children are forced to leave school today. Fewer children are forced to do dangerous work or to get married. And many governments have put in place stronger systems to protect children from violence and exploitation. I'm going to dig down now a little bit in 3 particular areas: education, violence against children, and the voice of children, which thankfully is getting louder each day. In all of these areas, again, we see plights and rights. We see a mixture of triumphs and setbacks, of rights being firmly upheld, but unfortunately, plights circling like vultures. I'm going to start with education. I had a great opportunity yesterday to speak with and learn from some teachers from Pinellas County, so education is on my mind. There actually has been extraordinary progress on school enrollment in recent decades around the world, and the percentage of children out of school has fallen worldwide and in every region since the turn of the century. Country after country abolished the school fees that had shut out so many children from school, and putting a lie to the fact that parents didn't want to send their children to school, children poured into the world's classrooms in their millions. More children and adolescents today are enrolled in pre-primary, primary, and secondary education than at any time in history. And on any given school day, more than 1 billion children around the world head to class. And in the vast majority of countries, at least at the primary level, the gender gap in education has almost closed. Not in the secondary level, however. But this flood of children, and it was a flood, into schools has created its own challenges. Education systems that were not ready for this influx have buckled under the sheer weight of numbers. Add to this that the education offered to children does not always live up to its promises. As a result, some countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that have made so much effort to get their children into school have seen hard-won achievements on enrollment start to falter. In every region of the world, with the exception of South and West Asia, it seems, unfortunately, that progress has stalled. To put it bluntly, we're flatlining. According to the most recent data, and this data comes from UNESCO, there has been little or no progress on the situation of out-of-school children over the past decade. In 2018, which is when we have the last good data, 1 in 6, or nearly 260 million children, adolescents, and youth were denied the right to education. What is happening in education confirms that, as with so many other rights, a lot depends on who you are and where you are. This is so much about equity. If you are poor, you are more likely to be out of school. Children from the poorest households almost 5 times more likely to to be out of primary school than those from the richest. If you have a disability or come from an ethnic minority, you are more likely to be out of school. If you come from a rural area or a conflict zone where war is taking place, and the average years of war have increased over the last 2 decades. Wars last now for 10, 15, 20 years. You guessed it, you are more likely to be out of school. And despite the progress on the gender gap, if you are a girl, particularly a girl from a poor family, the odds may still be stacked against you. Just last month, a UNICEF report pointed out that 1/3 of the world's poorest girls, aged 10 to 18, have never set foot in school. The report warned that for too many of the world's poorest children, there is just simply no school at all, a situation that isn't helped by education budgets that are often skewed toward children from wealthier families. We have found out the hard way that access to education is only one part of the equation. It has to go, the equity issue, access, has to go hand in hand with quality. That is why the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal for Education, it's SDG 4, takes the right to an education to a whole new level, from the Millennium Development Goal, the MDG, which said all children should get a primary education, but only required it to be 75% and didn't talk then about quality. SDG 4, Sustainable Development Goal, does. It demands a quality education for every child as a prelude to lifelong learning. It recognizes that simply getting the child into the classroom is not enough. We know it's not enough because millions of children enroll in schools, complete their education, and emerge at the other end without ever having gained even the most basic skills they need for the rest of their lives. In all, an estimated 617 million children and adolescents around the world are unable to read, write, or handle a simple maths calculation. Sure, some of these are children who've never seen the inside of a classroom, but actually 2/3 of them are in school. Quality doesn't just mean enough classrooms. It means enough classrooms that are safe and well-equipped and welcoming, classrooms that are truly, you could call them child-friendly. They don't have to be perfect, but child-friendly. Not just education that instills facts, and more facts, rote, but education that inspires, that unleashes a child's full potential. And quality doesn't just mean enough teachers, but enough well-trained and properly paid teachers, and ideally, enough female teachers to make girls, and boys as well, feel at ease in school. Teachers who listen, who encourage debate, who expect and encourage children to think, to question, to probe. Which brings me to another education plight. Ideally, every child has a teacher who has been properly trained and who has every skill they need to inspire and enthuse their pupils. And ideally, this teacher will teach generation after generation of children, becoming one of those teachers, and we've all had them, that we remember with gratitude for the rest of our lives. Worldwide, around 85% of primary teachers, now we're just talking primary teachers, were considered trained in 2018. In sub-Saharan Africa, this, however, fell to 64%, and that was down from 71% in 2005. Training for secondary school, the statistics are far worse. Teachers also need decent conditions and strong support, yet in sub-Saharan Africa, only 34% of primary schools had electricity in 2018. Only 44% had safe drinking water. Across the world's low-income countries, only 1 in every 4 primary schools has a single-sex toilet, a problem that matters more than you might think, particularly for girls. In fact, separate sanitary facilities may be one of the most important elements to keep girls into school, from primary school into secondary school. And we know that if girls get an education, particularly into secondary school, that they are more likely to have healthy children, they are less likely to be victims of violence, they are less likely to become infected with HIV and AIDS, and their families are more likely to be economically stable. They may not be rich, they still may be poor, but economically stable. A multiplier, simply, in many cases, by having a separate sanitary facility at a school. Girls also suffer from the lack of female teachers, particularly in the places where they are most needed. The more remote the school, the less likely it is to have a female teaching staff. In India, for example, the share of female teachers plummets from around 60% in a school in a regional capital to 30% if the school is around 15 miles away. And something that we're increasingly dealing with today, not just today, but more recently, children on the move desperately need more teachers. Consider these statistics. If every refugee child in Turkey enrolled in school, for example, the country would need an additional 80,000 teachers. Germany would need another 42,000 teachers. And Uganda would need another 7,000. So what needs to happen? Well, clearly we need a stronger focus not only on quality, but on quality combined with equity, so that the millions of children still out of school and the millions who are in school but not learning have a fair chance to a good quality education. Again, so much has happened, but so much needs still to be done. So let me turn to violence against children. When it comes to violence against children, I must unfortunately start with the plights, because it is impossible to sugarcoat what is happening. Every child has the right to freedom from violence. That right is embedded in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but it's also embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG target 16.2. Gets a little lost there, but 16.2, very important. Yet the violence inflicted upon children is relentless, and new risks are constantly emerging to put them in danger. Let me offer, again, a few numbers. I hope I'm not boring you with the numbers, but they are shocking in my view. Every 5 minutes, somewhere on our planet, violence takes the life of another child. Every year, at least 1 billion children, half of the world's children, experience violence. 3 in every 4 children under the age of 5 experience violence, discipline at the hands of those who are supposed to care for them. And in schools, 1 in every 2 children faces violence from their peers. Children now account for 30% of those who are trafficked, and the trafficking itself is increasingly motivated by sexual exploitation. Again, there are equity issues. No child is immune to violence, but some children are particularly vulnerable. Again, children with disabilities, for example, are almost 4 times more likely to experience violence than other children. Refugee and migrant children often find that violence is their constant companion, driving them from their homes, accompanying them on their journey, and waiting for them when they get to their destination. Girls are affected disproportionately by certain forms of violence, including sexual violence. But boys as well are affected more than we once thought. And both girls and boys are highly unlikely to report those who hurt them. The combination of shame, fear, and simply having no clue where to turn keeps them silent. How can it be that where seized images or videos of child sexual abuse depict boys and very young children, the abuse is likely to be more violent and more severe? How can it be that the age of victims in such images seems to be falling? An estimated 72% of children exploited online are under the age of 10, and 7% are infants. Whereas my pal at Interpol describes it These children are pre-speech. The sheer volume and scale of abusive images has reached unprecedented levels, with many individual offenders found to possess not just hundreds. Remember the old days of the briefcase with some pictures? Not anymore. Individual offenders found to possess not just hundreds, nor just thousands, but millions of images. How has it come to this? Well, in part because it's easy. With a click of a button, offenders can have children delivered to their hotel room or to their flat, their apartment, or anywhere else they choose. They can live stream their abuse or create their own networks or store materials on the cloud so that they do not have to carry them through airports or other checkpoints. We could be forgiven for sinking into despair to say, well, this is just the way the world is. It's inevitable. There's nothing we can do. But that's exactly what people used to say about corporal punishment or child marriage, which is another more insidious form of violence against children. Yet within the space of a single generation, we've actually seen real progress on these rights. What's more, we now have real momentum to end all forms of violence against children, and that includes sexual exploitation. This momentum is fueled by a marked shift in attitudes with growing consensus that violence against children is intolerable and growing confidence, this is based on robust evidence, that it is not inevitable. Around 60 countries now have comprehensive legislation to ban violence against children in all its forms, including everywhere, including in schools and, importantly, in the home. More and more countries are putting laws in place to outlaw child marriage and female genital mutilation. In 2018, for example, UNICEF reported that global rates of child marriage were falling, with 25 million child marriages averted over the past decade. Children, and this is really important, have often been the driving progress on these issues. Again, I'll give a couple examples. For example, the Rise Up for Girls initiative in Guatemala and in Malawi has involved girls at every stage in efforts to tackle child marriage. In Guatemala, they have created a national violence observatory to report cases of violence against girls and women, with more than 700 girls referred to date. In Malawi, in Africa, more than 10,000 girls supported the push to increase the legal age of marriage to 18, triggering a change in that country's constitution. Changes in legislation, coupled usually and always with such grassroots action, sends out a clear signal about the kind of people we want to be. I hope we want to be. People who see violence against children as simply unacceptable. So in my view, there's no reason to be fatalistic or despairing about the prospects of ending violence against children. Where it actually has been made a priority, where people have worked together, we have seen progress. Now we need to take what we've found works and bring it to scale. The momentum to tackle violence against children must be accelerated to push back against every threat to their safety, old or new. And that means listening to and working with those in the greatest danger, the children themselves. And that brings me to my third and final discussion area, the voice of children. As well as changing the way we view children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has helped to change the way in which children view themselves. It has helped to reshape child participation. And I have to tell you, it did need reshaping. 30 years ago, as I was starting out as executive director of UNICEF, not quite 30 years, but almost, what passed for child participation, and I must admit I was part of this, was often limited to a session at the beginning of a conference or a summit or a workshop. Children came up on the stage, they danced on the stage in the national costume of whatever country that we were in at that time. They sang a happy song of welcome, and then they danced off again. And I'm afraid to say that was pretty much child participation at that point. But then we have the convention, and in particular Article 12, which says children have the right to be heard, to have a say in the decisions that affect them. The transformation of child participation over the past 3 decades has been extraordinary. We have seen dramatic shifts. You've seen it as well, from children dancing or singing, and that's great, but to children taking part in debates, to children helping to design and develop solutions to social problems they face. For the most part, these shifts have been driven by adults who have invited children to what had previously remained adult discussions and debates. But we're starting to see another shift now, a marked shift. Children are no longer waiting for us adults to send them an invite. They are going their own way without waiting for our permission. Back in 2009, aged just 11, I don't think I could find the school bus when I was 11, but aged just 11, Malala Yousafzai wrote a blog under another name for the BBC's Urdu service about her life in Pakistan, in an area under Taliban control. This blossomed into a mass movement to support the right of every girl to an education. Here in the United States, children and young people have been speaking out on violence, including, as you are all well aware, the survivors of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida, who lost 17 classmates in 2018. They have been instrumental in creating the Never Again movement, a student-led action committee for gun control. And as a result, around 1 million students have taken part in protests against gun violence around the country. Global school strikes pushing for action on climate change started with one Swedish girl sitting alone on a sidewalk, holding a cardboard sign. Now Greta Thunberg is one of millions of children who are challenging us adults to step up and to be honest, to grow up, and deliver on our promises. Children and adults are speaking out as never before about their rights and their plights, often with a passion and commitment that puts the rest of us to shame. Quite rightly, they have attracted massive support. But this has also come at a price. Malala almost lost her life. The Parkland survivors have faced suspicion and hostility. And Greta Thunberg has faced ridicule from some of the world's most powerful leaders. I believe that just as child participation itself has changed, our role as adults must also change. Perhaps we need to let go a bit, to step back, and let them take the lead in some instances. Perhaps the most useful thing we can do is to help them speak out safely without exposing themselves to any further risk. They certainly have a lot to shout about. Still, millions of children have their rights violated. Still, too many childhoods are cut short. Still, children die and suffer because of poverty, malnutrition, lack of health care, or violence. And this new decade of the 21st century brings new challenges for child rights as more children grow up in a digital world, a world on the move, and a world affected dramatically by climate change. But children also have new opportunities to claim their rights, and they are increasingly seizing these opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, we are just 10 years from the deadline to achieve these global goals, the SDGs. Child rights, enforced, fulfilled, guaranteed, will help us meet these deadlines. It is time, it's probably overdue, but it is time to recapture the hope, the vision, and the commitment to action that actually gave birth to the Convention on the Rights of the Child 3 decades ago. To take stock of how far we've come and to re-energize ourselves to move forward. Back then, we were relatively passive consumers of the news. Today, we can make the news ourselves. We can see what is happening in real time, and we can, if necessary, hold those responsible to account. We can connect with each other as never before, and that is a game changer for child rights and for a solution to their plights. So here is my little wish list for the 2020s. I'm sure you might have others to add. I have a few. Let's have more national and local governments making a fresh pledge to children that they will deliver the Convention on the Rights of the Child in full, and they will tie it to their pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's ensure that policies for children on paper gain traction for children in reality. That means policies that are enforced and resourced. Let's expand what works for children, especially for those who are the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. Let's help children take the lead, because what works better when they are part of the solution. Let's help more children not only claim their rights, but also become the change that they want to see. And finally, let's sharpen our focus on equity, on bringing everyone with us as we make progress, with nobody, and certainly no child, ever left behind. I thank you very much for inviting me today. We're going to take questions, right?
Okay, I want to thank Carol Bellamy, and you haven't heard the last of her yet. You have about
That's a terrible threat.
a half an hour for questions. We have at least one, if not, we have two people with one on each side with microphones. So if you raise your hand, the microphone will be brought to you, and you can ask your questions. I also want to remind you that Carol will be with us tomorrow and will be participating in two panels, one on women's equality, when is the battle won, and another one on the many facets of terrorism. So we encourage you to go to those as well. Okay, now for questions.
Oh, yes, hi.
Hello. I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I was aware that the United States was not a signatory to the convention. When I looked up to see why it was that we were not restrained in putting children in cages, is it correct that if we were a signatory, we would not be allowed to put children in cages?
I suppose I would hope that suppose I would hope that whether we are a signatory or not, we would feel it's not the correct thing to put children in cages. So well, the U.S. First of all, the U.S. is very reluctant to sign any international treaties. That's a start, and so it's been very slow to sign. I don't think it's even signed the women's. That doesn't surprise me about the U.S. either, but I don't think it's signed the Women's Treaty either. And it's argued, there has been quite a vocal, small, I shouldn't say small, but vocal, not particularly large, but quite a vocal group within the United States that argued if you give children rights, you're taking away parents' rights. And the convention is quite clear that you're not taking away parents' rights. I mean, it's very clear about that. But that kind of is an argument that if you just hear it and you don't know much more, you would think, oh, well, that makes sense, and then you're not for it. It doesn't allow for external intervention in a country. I mean, it encourages countries to be the best they can be. So it's not as though somebody could march, if the U.S. had signed it, could march into the country and then say you shouldn't put children in, well, they could come into the country and say you shouldn't put children in cages, but it doesn't give them a legal right to do that. So it really just, the convention is strong, but it encourages countries to basically do the best things for children, and putting children in cages is not the best thing. but it wouldn't, by its nature, prevent it from occurring. Hopefully, it would be by its values keep it from occurring. So, yes, I'm sorry. I'm trying to be. I will try and be quick and take whatever question. Yeah.
Thank you for coming, and thank you so much for the work you've been doing. For many years, the Israeli Defense Forces have been barging into Palestinian homes, taking these children out of their bedrooms with their families, and then putting them in detention areas for many years, often mistreated, tortured, and put in detention areas as forced confessions. I know you don't.
I don't want to hear this.
Could you?
This is a different talk.
Could you
Have the
please
right to
comment
bring this up.
on the children misuse?
Oh,
Thank you.
you're promoting lies.
Well, I will say that I think the UN now calls it the State of Palestine. It used to be Occupational Palestinian, OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territories, but I believe the official title now is the State of Palestine. The children clearly in those countries have had significant challenges, although in those areas. But I will say that the Palestinian government has made very significant attempts to keep a strong education system, and I think they should be encouraged to continue to do that. I recall when I was at UNICEF, UNICEF worked closely to try and make sure that the annual exams took place, which meant that the children got a decent education. So the conditions in both the West Bank and Gaza are really quite terrible due to many things. In some instances, Israel, but in other instances, in some bad Palestinian leadership. But the commitment for good education, I think, is something to be celebrated and supported, and I'm glad they do that.
Thank you for sharing these statistics. And obviously, if there are no measurements, you cannot manage any issue. In terms of monitoring progress or lack thereof, are there any ramifications that your organization can impose? Because typically if a government is not compliant and is not enforcing policies, it's hard then to expect change and improvement. And in particular, I'm very curious if the private sector corporations have been used as additive agent for change in those countries.
I suppose there's several points to that. Well, first of all, fact-based decision-making is always much better. So the more information or data you have, the better it is. And we are, whether it's around children or other issues, we are better in the world today in gathering information and being able to use that information. There are challenges to that. For example, much of the information that's gathered through the United Nations, and I'm biased, I will tell you, I'm a big supporter of many parts of the United Nations, not all parts. I always say the only thing harder than starting something at the UN is stopping something at the UN. But I happen to think that certainly the major UN humanitarian and development organizations, the World Health Program, World Health Organization, the World Food Program, the Refugee Agency, UNICEF, I'm biased, I admit, are really good. It doesn't mean they don't have some bureaucracy, they do. But information gathered by those organizations have to be official data, and sometimes that data can be manipulated. But there's also a very strong, globally today, there's a very strong civil society, and very often civil society organizations can also now have the capacity to gather information and can poke holes, and that's very useful sometimes. So I think civil society organizations around the world, good ones, there are too many of them probably, but good ones need to be supported because they are very useful in obtaining information. And the more information you have, the better you can make decisions, or the better you can identify where there are challenges. Again, with respect to children, there is the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and governments do report to that committee, but also, I'm speaking now particularly about civil society organizations, they review those reports and they also take those reports apart sometimes. So it's not a perfect world, but we do have better information. We're better able to, and we now have actually now on the good side, I mean, virtually everybody in the world, from the poorest country to the richest, has some handheld. They may not all be smartphones, but even in the most rural communities today, young people or children or adults can determine whether they can report on whether teachers are showing up, whether there is clean water, whether things that were promised are actually happening. So my response to you is, I think we need to use good information. That good information doesn't always result in making something better, but it allows for there to be greater pressure to force trying to make things better, and we should use that information. Just pulling something out of thin air does not work. Use good information, use that information, work with others to get that information, and then try and make a difference with it. Yeah.
Thank you for your...
I'm sorry, I'm glad to take as many people as I can. Yes.
Thank you for your talk here. And my question or remark is actually...
I can't hear you, I'm sorry. If you can just speak more into the microphone.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. I appreciate it. It was wonderful to listen to. Two comments. One is, what I missed actually is, what about family? Husband, wife, raising their children. Nothing what mentions about that. A lot about education, but family unit is extremely important in my opinion, number one. And number two, you mentioned nothing about the rights of the unborn.
Well, I do believe, I believe families are very important. I believe there are many kinds of families. And I don't think there should be an assumption that a family is simply mom and dad and Joey and Susie and dog Muffy. But again, families are very important. We know, for example, in places where you know, one of the parents goes to another part of the world for economic reasons, that has implications for the children. You know, the more parents struggle, the more, as with most situations, it isn't usually due to one particular thing. So that if, for example, one of the adults in the family is ill, or one of the adults in the family may have an addiction, that can have implications as well. So I spoke about children not as separate from the environment within which they live. In fact, children without having some kind of loving environment is not a good thing. What that loving environment may be could be quite different in many instances. But children do need a loving, little children particularly they need play. Play is very important for little children, and so it's very important for the adults who are around little children to give them the opportunity to play. So families are very important. I was speaking about some of the elements particularly affecting children in this case. It's the parents who, many cases, weren't able to send the children to school because of the school fees, so that when the school fees were done away with, the children went to school. It is, in many instances, in most cases, but not all, it's the mother is going to bring the child to get immunized early on, which is probably the best kind of health intervention in the entire world to assure that their child will not die from a preventable cause before the age of 5. With respect to the unborn, I have my personal views on that, and I will not, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to respond to your question on that one. Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Many in this audience have worked with children who have been traumatized. Nurses, social workers, psychologists. I happen to be both a pediatrician and a child psychiatrist. There's sort of a double tragedy that is hand in hand that's happening. First of all, a child who experiences trauma never really rises above that trauma throughout their lifetime. The trauma now, with a very high level of cortisol, affects the brain development, the immune system, the lung system. It's a very sad situation, what we're learning. But the double tragedy is these scientists that are studying these effects are not being supported by the government leaders. They are undermining scientific inquiry in some of the most important areas to how to understand trauma. Thank you very much.
I'm probably going to offend all the obstetricians in the audience, but I love pediatricians. The obstetricians just come, you have the baby, they leave. But the pediatricians, they stay around. So, I'm sorry, obstetrician, I still love you, actually, too. Trauma has enormous implications, and we live in a world today where there is more and more conflict in the world today. I mean, the wars have changed. The wars of the kind of the 21st century are not the wars of the 20th century. I mean, wars aren't good anyway. I'm not saying good or bad, but the wars of the 20th century were largely wars between nation states. And we certainly didn't have easy ways of dealing with them, but there were some rules of engagement. The wars of the 21st century, for the most part, are within nations. And we have virtually no rules of engagement. They are largely around ethnic differences, tribal differences, religious differences, north and south differences, and there's so many of them, and they're just the trauma that families and particularly young people and the greatest victims of conflict today are women and children. They're the ones, if you go to just places with displaced camps or refugee camps, you'll find me mostly women and children. I don't mean the men are happy. They're usually off, well, they're fighting, sometimes the children are too, or they're off with the livestock, but the implications for women and children are quite dramatic. I'm going to talk about a particular gripe that I have. I mean, in the field of interventions, life-saving types of interventions, in the humanitarian field, whether it's a natural disaster like a earthquake or flooding or something like that, or conflict, health interventions are always seen as something that you have to do immediately. Health interventions, get them water. They do always forget sanitation, but they get them water and let's keep them alive. And many of us have, for a long time, argued that education is critical at that point. But it's seen as something, wait till the conflict, wait till the things calm down, wait till things are like quiet again. I mean, they can still be poor, but wait till things are quiet again, and then we'll get back to that education thing. Well, it doesn't really work that way, particularly if you have wars that go on for 15 or 20 years. But secondly, one of the most important things you can do for a child in an abnormal situation that is creating trauma is to create some normalcy. And restoring some kind of education. I'm not talking about a beautiful building, but it may be even just under a tree with somebody, to give them an opportunity to do some kind of a learning, restoring a little bit of normalcy in that otherwise abnormal situation is very important in trying to reduce some of that trauma. But trying to get folks in the development field to recognize, I'm saying education, but some kind of education type of intervention as a life-saving intervention as much as a health intervention has been very difficult. So trauma is something clearly we haven't focused as much on with children, and we're doing a little bit more now. Also the trauma from many of the child protection issues. You know, the convention was adopted, and in those days there was a big focus on health, and then there got to be a little bit more of a focus as well, not leaving health behind on education, but protection issues. And protection, by that I mean everything from trafficking to sexual exploitation to just basic violence against children. Those are issues that people still struggle with. They don't want to admit it's happening in their communities, in their neighborhoods, or in their countries, and they don't want to admit the trauma. So it is an area that deserves much more attention. I can't comment on the scientists. I don't know. I read the newspapers, and we don't seem to have any scientists in Washington anymore, but I don't know whether we have any scientists anywhere else. So that one I can't comment on. I'm sorry.
I'd like to focus your attention on an issue that's happening right here in this country. And I speak as someone who lives in a metropolitan area where students sit on the Board of Education. And I speak as the proud grandfather of one of the million children who marched in the wake of Parkland. So, question, why are there still more incidents in schools? And why the hell don't we have gun control if a million kids are out there campaigning? Forget the rest of the world. I want to keep my grandchildren, my children, safe. Your reaction, please.
Could I come out and ask that same question instead? I can't answer that. I have no idea. I have no idea. I mean, if people want to hunt, I don't want to hunt, but if people want to hunt, that's fine. But it seems to me when you want to hunt, you have a bullet, not something that is 57,000 bullets in 3 minutes or something like that. So that's what I don't understand. So as with, I'm not really appropriate to comment on that, but what I will comment on is I do believe in organizing. I believe in continuing to advocate, and I believe in, ultimately I believe in the power of people. I'm sorry if that sounds mushy, but I do believe in the power of people, and the power of people have made a difference. And while I talked about some of the real challenges that still remain for children, really, I just take you back 30 years, there's been a dramatic improvement. And it didn't just happen, frankly, with all due respect to having just a convention. It happened because people got out there and made a difference. So if whatever it is that you're for, you and I may agree on some things, but get out there or do or support or think about or send some money to or encourage your family to get involved in the things that you think are important, because I think we make a difference, and I really believe strongly about that. So that's all. I'm glad to take some more questions. I don't want to keep you here too long. The good news is you get food and then a concert after this. So if you had to put up with me, at least you get food and a concert. So
thanks again for your remarks and incredible insight, and thanks very much to the organizers for bringing such an important dialogue and an incredible schedule ahead of awesome things to St. Pete and the Bay Area. I work in international education, and I really appreciated your highlighting of education's role in the broader humanitarian efforts. One of the neat things about the last 30 years is that the area of women and girls and gender has expanded from just being about women and girls to thinking about gender more broadly and everyone's role in creating and reimagining solutions. And I wonder if there's anything, those of us who work in child protection and education, can we learn from the field of gender that of course still pays attention to women and girls specific as important subpopulations, but looks more broadly? Can we move from thinking just about youth to sort of thinking about different generations and how generations support each other so that we maintain our focus on children, but still think about the role of these generations working together? It kind of ties into some of the earlier questions, but thanks again for any thoughts.
well, I did spend, I've spent about half my life in the public sector. I did spend the other half in the private sector. I say there was one time in my life I'd been a Wall Street lawyer and a New York politician and an investment banker. I only needed to do real estate, and then I would have been in every sleazy profession that you could be in. But I say that because, as I said a little bit in my comments, I like to think about investments and return on investment. And I think you can really make a strong argument, again, around things like girls' education, around, investment. You can make a strong argument about investing, we forget, but in maternal mortality, you can make a strong investment about confronting the really high rates, unfortunately, including in this country, and particularly women of color, of maternal mortality, by recognizing that, just for a modest investment, these women are more likely to be healthy, and their children are more likely to be healthy. So I like to make arguments around investment. I don't think it just is, ooh, this is the good thing to do, although that's a great thing. I mean, we should all think it's a good thing to do, but I like to make some arguments around investing. And when we talk about gender, we can't forget boys, and we can't forget young men either. So when we talk about gender, we have to remember we need to invest, frankly, in both. And then finally, come to the workshop tomorrow on gender. It's at 11-ish. It's on your thing. I'm going to take the last question. I'm glad to respond to others here, but I see some people need to leave, I guess. And
Okay.
all right, maybe that gentleman. Yes.
I have had the privilege of seeing child education in Nepal and Bangladesh and Bosnia after the war. But I'm wondering if you could share the kind of impact that something like the Grameen Bank has had on families and child education. And its equivalent in other countries, not just Bangladesh.
Well, Grameen Bank, again, I think many of you are aware, and they weren't just limited, they started in Bangladesh, they weren't just limited there. I mean, provided micro loans, and in many cases, mostly to women, and because they realized that the women had much more, turned out, the women paid them back in most cases, and they didn't always get paid back by the guys, in some cases, but much more by the women, and it gave women some value to themselves, and so that was really important. And so it's made a difference. I mean, you can sometimes you have to think though. Sometimes things backfire just a little bit, and not Grameen Bank. I'm a big fan of Grameen Bank. I'm not a fan always of microcredit. I always used to think, how come the women get microcredit and the guys get macrocredit? So I mean, I think, I don't think microcredit. I don't think there's any silver bullet. I think microcredit in some cases has been very important. For example, the greatest number of, in the field of agriculture in the world today, the greatest number of small farmers are women, and some of the opportunities they've had when they've been able to get small loans have been very important. So I think microcredit is one of many tools, not the only one, but many tools that have been positively used in many parts of the world to help begin to reduce the impact of poverty. And I think that's very important, and it should continue to be a tool. I just don't think it's the only one. And as I said, I'm going to give you two small examples of backfiring. I apologize for this, but when I was at UNICEF, we were working, it might have been Bangladesh, I think it was Bangladesh, to try and reduce the number, no, it was Pakistan, to try and reduce the number of children who were involved in child labor. And so we were working with some business organizations and microcredit and the government to try and reduce the number of children who are involved in child labor. And the business and the microcredit was being used to support the children being able to go to a really good school. Not the state-run schools, but a good school. And so that was one of the encouraging things to try and keep the younger children from going into child labor. They could go into this good school. And then one day somebody knocked on the door and they said, do we have to send our children into child labor for them to be able to go to a good school? Because the state schools were not the equivalent of this better school. So you have to think about that sometime. You also said, and this is a totally different issue, but you mentioned Bosnia, or BH, Bosnia-Herzegovina. So here's another one of Bellamy's really terrific ideas. When I was executive director of UNICEF, the war was going on. I remember the first time I went to Sarajevo, actually the trams were not running. They were on their sides along the road so people could walk behind them and avoid being killed by snipers. I must say, the last time I went to Sarajevo, the trams were running. So I know the world can get better. But we wanted to help the children in school, and so we thought the way to help the children in school, we needed to provide them some supplies, and to really cheer them up, we were going to provide them with colored chalk, along with the supplies. We have a school in a box. It's a very good a UNICEF program, but we wanted to use colored chalk. Well, the problem with that was many of the schools actually went into cellars, so again, they couldn't be seen, and they had put, gauze and black over the windows so they couldn't be seen, so they could continue to school. And so if you had white chalk, you could see it, but if you had colored chalk, you couldn't see it. And here was our way of really helping these kids, except they couldn't see the chalk anymore, so we got them white chalk. So, maybe last, I'm sorry.
Yes, back to education. I'm another person who works in international education. And in the projects, the first stuff we started with is feeding the children, because a lot of children weren't being fed, and that brought them to school. That's the World Food Bank's program, and we were doing that. But the problem was we had more teachers, we did everything, but back to the training. These teachers, like in Nepal in particular, they were high school education at best, had no real techniques, they didn't have globes in the school, and we're talking so basic of situation. So we started doing at least training them to look at things differently, look at what's in their environment. And you brought that up, and I wanted to just say that is an important thing that you cannot do, because you can get the teachers, you can get the food, you can do them, but you got to get them to graduate. That's the big problem.
Yeah, one of the big challenges is that in so many parts of the world, at best, the teachers may have had a primary education. And so, that may or may not be okay for teaching in primary school. I don't mean it's great, but at least they've had some education. But it means that to the extent to which there really is now an effort to make sure that children not only get a primary education, but at least a secondary education, the available training for teachers for secondary education is really very, very, very limited. And the other problem is, if you look at many countries, particularly poorer countries, the education budget may be the largest budget of that government. And it's largely because of teacher salaries. But it's not that the teachers are earning big salaries, it's a large portion of their budget, but there's so little left over for anything else. So A, the teachers aren't earning very much, but B, there's almost nothing left over. But it's always seen, that so much money is going into education. Now, the challenge also isn't just to throw money at it. It is also to try to make it be more useful in some cases, because in some cases it is not. Again, it's interesting. Modern technology can help in some ways. Again, with that handheld, frankly, teachers that actually did show up in rural areas often had to leave for a week to come down to the major city to get paid. Now we can do money transfers through even a simple handheld. If you have a wall, just a wall in your community using a handheld, you can display things on that wall, education information, so that maybe the fact you have no books whatsoever, but there may still be some ways to get to use it. So there are ways to also use modern technology in simple ways that can be helpful in education today. Okay, thank you very much.